All right, today we're diving into one of the most game-changing periods in all of human history, what historians call the long 19th century. We're talking about the 125 years between two massive global shifts, a time when the world we live in today was literally forged. So, how did it happen? Let's get into it.
This painting by Turner, it just perfectly captures the whole story. You've got this beautiful, majestic old sailing ship, a hero of old battles, being hauled off to the scrapyard. And what's pulling it? This tiny, grimy, but incredibly powerful steam tugboat. It's such a powerful metaphor, right? An entire world, once powered by wind and muscle, being dragged away by the new age of steam and fossil fuels.
And that really brings us to our central question. I mean, just think about this for a second. How on earth did humanity change more in these 125 years than in the entire 1,000 years before that? Well, the answer is a kind of perfect storm of revolutionary ideas, world-changing technology, and a brand new kind of global connection. Okay, so the first catalyst wasn't a machine. It was a revolution of the mind. All the old accepted ways of thinking about how society and power and money worked, they were about to be completely shattered. To really get why things exploded, you have to see the powder keg everyone was sitting on. This chart just lays out the insane injustice of what was called the old regime. You had the clergy and the nobility. They owned a ton of the land, but paid basically zero taxes. The entire financial weight of the country fell on the third estate, the common people, who made up 98% of the population. A system this lopsided, it just can't hold. And here was the trigger, the thing that lit the fuse. After some bad harvests, the price of bread, the food that kept everyone alive, just went through the roof. By the summer of 1789, your average worker was spending 3/4 of their entire income just to not starve. And when people are hungry, they get desperate. When they get desperate, things get revolutionary. And the final piece of this disastrous puzzle? The state itself was flat broke. The French government was spending way more than it was taking in. And look at this, most of that spending was just paying the interest on its massive debt. So you have a bankrupt monarchy, a starving population, and a social structure that's about to topple over. It was all going to come crashing down. But here's the thing. While this political revolution was brewing in France, a different kind of revolution, an intellectual one, had already been kicked off by this book. Back in 1776, a guy named Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, and it basically proposed a whole new operating system for how economies should run. Smith's whole argument completely flipped the old ideas on their head. The old way of thinking was that wealth was like a fixed pie. For your country to get a bigger slice, you had to take it from someone else. But Smith came along and said, no. He argued that if individuals pursue their own self-interest, if you have competition, specialization, and free trade, this invisible hand would actually make the entire pie bigger, creating more wealth for everybody. This was the ideological fuel for the economic explosion that was about to happen. So, new ideas were the spark, but technology was the engine. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about a couple of new gadgets. It was about fundamentally changing how human beings made, everything. The acceleration is just incredible. I mean, look at this. You go from the first real factory in 1771 to a steam engine on wheels, to the mass production of steel, and then, boom, to Ford's assembly line. Each one of these was a massive leap forward, building on the last and changing the world faster than ever before. Now, to understand just how revolutionary this was, you need to get this one concept, the Malthusian trap. You see, for basically all of human history, we were stuck in this cycle. Whenever a society got a little bit richer or its population grew, it would eventually hit a ceiling. There'd be too many people for the amount of food available, and you'd get famine, disease, and collapse. It was seen as an iron law of nature. Until this. This graph right here shows the Great Escape. For the very first time in history, the amount of wealth per person started to climb, and it just kept on climbing. This wasn't some temporary boom. This was real, sustained growth. And here's the real kicker. This incredible rise in wealth was happening at the exact same time as a massive population explosion. So you have more people and more wealth for each person. This was the definitive proof. By unlocking the energy in fossil fuels, humanity had finally broken the Malthusian trap. We were on a totally new path now, one of exponential growth that would define the entire modern era.
And of course, this economic escape completely remade society. In just a couple of generations, these nations went from being mostly agricultural, where almost everyone worked on a farm, to being dominated by industry and services. This meant millions of people moved from the countryside into huge, new, crowded cities. The entire rhythm of human life was changed forever. But, and this is a really big but, this incredible engine of change was not shared equally. Not even close. The same forces that were making some parts of the world fantastically rich were also creating a huge, widening gap between them and everybody else. This is what we call the Great Divergence. And honestly, nothing shows this divergence more clearly than these two maps. In 1880, Africa is a continent of thousands of independent kingdoms, states, and societies. Now look at the map from 1913. Just over 30 years later, it's been almost entirely carved up and consumed by European empires, a conquest made possible by new industrial technologies like the machine gun. This was the scramble for Africa. This table really puts some cold, hard numbers on it. Back in 1800, the difference in industrialization between, say, the UK and China wasn't that big. They were pretty close. But by 1913, wow, the UK and the US have just skyrocketed, while China and India have actually gone backward. The gap became a chasm. So the big question is, why? What decided who got on which side of that divide? Well, the very different stories of Japan and China give us a powerful clue. When faced with the industrial power of the West, Japan responded with what's called the Meiji Restoration, a deliberate top-down revolution to rapidly modernize and adopt Western tech. Also, they could stay independent. China's Qing dynasty, on the other hand, tried to resist change, was crushed in the Opium Wars, and was forced into what became known as a century of humiliation. And this image, it's a haunting look at the economics behind that humiliation. The British were buying lots of tea from China, but weren't selling them much in return. To fix that trade imbalance, they started growing opium on an industrial scale in their colony, India, and then forced it on the Chinese market, getting millions of people addicted and crippling the state. It was a vicious form of free trade, backed by military force. So let's pull all these threads together now. You've got the industrial engine, this great divergence in wealth, and the new imperialism. What you end up with is something the world had never, ever seen before, the first truly interconnected global economy. And what made it all possible? Well, it was a whole suite of technologies that basically destroyed distance. Steamships and railways made it cheap and fast to move stuff around the globe. The telegraph meant a message could get from London to New York in minutes instead of weeks. And on top of all that, new kinds of global finance and mass migration tied the world together with flows of money and people on a scale never seen before. So let's just recap this massive transformation. We went from muscle and wind power to fossil fuels, from handmade crafts to mass production, from societies based on farming to societies based on factories and offices, from tiny family businesses to huge global corporations. And the result of it all was a world that was more connected, more dynamic, but also more unequal than at any other time in history. You know, this map of the first telegraph cables under the Atlantic, it's the perfect final image. This is the nervous system of the new globalized world, a web of wires transmitting information, money, and power at the speed of electricity. The world was truly wired together. Which leaves us with one final and pretty chilling question. By 1914, the world had built this incredibly complex, integrated global system. It had created more wealth than in all of prior history combined. So why? Why in the summer of that exact same year was it about to plunge into the most destructive war the world had ever seen? Well, that is a story for another day.